which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Karen, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 22nd, 2026 issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, our first article is going to be titled, U.S. and Israel Differ on Defining Victory. For Netanyahu, fears about the Mideast may clash with Trump's worries on oil. Israel launched a major attack on an Iranian gas field last week, prompting retaliation against Gulf states, a threat to global energy supplies, and a surge in fuel prices. President Trump first insisted the United States knew nothing about the strike, but later backtracked and said he warned Israel against attacking the complex. His attempt to distance his administration from the strike underscored the diverging aims of the United States and Israel as their war against Iran grinds on. As a superpower with global responsibilities, the United States cares deeply about global energy supplies and the safety of its Persian Gulf allies. And with crucial midterm elections later this year, the Trump administration cares deeply about the rising price of gasoline in the United States. But as a regional power, Israel has different strategic aims and more narrow concerns, analysts and former officials say. Israel has its own natural gas, little dependency on the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran has a chokehold on the transport of fuel, and no responsibility for the free flow of global trade. The stakes for Israel are higher than for the United States. It sees Iran, sworn to the destruction of Israel, as a clear danger from its nuclear program and especially from its ballistic missiles. Aaron David Miller, a former U.S. Middle East negotiator, now at the Carnegie Endowment, said, "We are a global power, and they are a regional one. So their threat assessments create a different set of objectives than ours. That divergence is inevitable," said Suzanne Maloney, an Iran expert and director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Not only are their goals fundamentally different, she said, but the costs the two sides can bear are even more different, especially over time. Washington is focused much more now on the problem of the Strait of Hormuz, she said, because a lengthy closure could mean a sustained global recession and higher fuel prices. Israel doesn't care as much about this, she said. They have a set of strategic objectives and believe they are succeeding, and they are not as price sensitive as the White House. They are more willing to weather the storm and try to finish the job. Israel is more determined than Washington to change the government in Iran, dismantling the Islamic Republic and its ballistic missile program, and to degrade Hezbollah, Iran's proxy force in southern Lebanon, to the point that it cannot threaten Israel again for many years. Israel is again more amenable, analysts said, to the possibility of state collapse and chaos in Iran than Washington appears to be. Having been on a war footing since Hamas attacked it from Gaza in October 2023, Israel is more willing to bear the costs and casualties and economic damage than the United States is likely to be. It sees an extraordinary opportunity to clobber Iran with American help, and it is likely to want to continue the war longer than Mr. Trump, these analysts said. So the attack on Iran's South Pars facility, from which Iran gets most of its natural gas for domestic consumption, was a logical move for Israel, as was an earlier bombing attack on Iranian fuel depots, which Washington also criticized privately, analysts and officials say. Mr. Trump's strong initial response to the South Pars strike, he said that Israel had violently lashed out at the gas field, was the reaction of a global power prompted by Iran's retaliatory strikes against Qatari and Saudi natural gas production facilities. Either way, Mr. Trump's fury will have an effect in Israel, where Mr. Netanyahu, who must conduct elections by October, cares deeply about keeping the American president and the U.S. military on his side. As a result, Israel will probably feel intense pressure to heed his orders to stop hitting Iran's gas fields and even to stop the war. At some point, Mr. Miller said, Netanyahu's interest in creating some different Iranian reality will confront Trump's need to stop. And when Trump needs to say stop, Netanyahu will reluctantly do so. On a superficial level, the two countries started with common goals of regime change and military dismantlement, including Iran's nuclear program, said Nathan Sachs, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. But Mr. Trump has spoken of a Venezuela-like solution with the current government still in place, albeit with people at the top whom the U.S. can control, and Israel has a much higher bar for a different leadership in Iran, he said. On a secondary level, Israel is focused on Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and the pillars of the regime, like the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Basij militia. The United States, Mr. Sachs said, is far more focused on Iran's short-range missiles and drones that can hit the Gulf, as well as its naval capacity. Most immediately, the need is to open the Strait of Hormuz. The price of oil, pressure from the Gulf states, and even the international markets matter to Israel, but far less than the U.S., he said. But Israel is sensitive to those concerns to the degree that they influence Mr. Trump, he added. Even if there is no regime change, Mr. Sachs said, Iran would be much weaker, and would be easier for Israel to apply forceful containment, a more elegant term for intermittent attacks. But the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, all key American allies, do not want a broken Iran that creates migration flows and more terrorism. The broader U.S. strategic interests include global energy markets, the Strait of Hormuz, how many munitions the U.S. is expending, the extended deployments of the Navy and air crews, the effect on the Ukraine war, and how it affects U.S. readiness in the Asia-Pacific, said David Shapiro, a former Pentagon official and former U.S. ambassador to Israel. These are not necessarily prominent in the middle of Israelis or Netanyahu. Most Israelis simply hoped for the demise of their nemesis. The two countries do share one crucial concern that has not dissipated: the fate of the 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that would be enough in principle to build 10 nuclear weapons, should Iran pursue that path. Though much of the uranium may be buried under the rubble of the June attacks on Isfahan, no one knows for sure, said Michael Milstein, a former Israeli intelligence officer at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. This is the Holy Grail, he said, but how that uranium can be destroyed or secured remains unclear, which is why some analysts still see the war ending in negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, even with a far weakened government in Tehran. Chuck Freilich, a former deputy national security advisor in Israel, fears too rapid a conclusion. If you resort to military force, which is not always the right thing to do, you should play to win, he said. Attempts to fight limited wars for limited purposes usually end up with the worst of all worlds. Whatever Israel prefers, he said, it comes down to whether Trump has the political will and stomach to stay the course or not. Next, we have pain at pump recalibrating the midterms. As they entered this midterm year, many Democratic and Republican politicians agreed on one central campaign theme. This would be an election about affordability, with both parties battling over who best addressed the high cost of housing, child care, groceries, health care, utilities, and gas. But President Trump's decision to attack Iran has complicated the equation and left Republicans pushing a different message. Please ignore the price at the pump. From Congress to the campaign trail, Republican leaders, elected officials, and candidates are promising that the increase in energy prices will be temporary, asking voters to bear the short-term pain to their pocketbooks for what they promise will be a long-term gain for their country. What we're paying at the gas pump is a small price to pay in order to save millions of lives in the future, Representative Buddy Carter, who is running for the Republican nomination for Senate in Georgia, where gas prices have increased nearly 40% over the past month, said in an interview on conservative television. This is a painful experience at the pump right now, but that is going to stabilize. It's a strategy that echoes that of the Biden administration, whose top officials promised the rise in inflation after COVID-19 pandemic would be transitory, and then spent years blaming culprits from the President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia to the Federal Reserve for continued high prices. I thought there was a chance it could be much worse, Mr. Trump told reporters gathered in the Oval Office on Thursday as oil prices spiked and stock markets gyrated. It's not bad, and it's going to be over with pretty soon. Such comments mark a notable reversal from just a month ago when Mr. Trump touted falling gas prices as a centerpiece of his economic success. As the war enters a fourth week, some Republican strategists are privately worrying that high gas prices will undercut their economic message for the midterms. Still, with the election more than 7 months away, costs could decline and foreign policy could fade as a concern among voters. How much patience voters will give the administration to prosecute a war with no clear end in sight is unclear. Democrats have pounced, seeing an opportunity to drive their economic message for the midterms while also tying Mr. Trump to an unpopular overseas conflict. I love when billionaires that are sitting on mountains of cash tell Americans who can't afford to pay their rent and their mortgage at the end of the month to just wait it out, said Representative Jason Crow of Colorado, a former Army Ranger and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee's candidate recruitment co-chairman. We are sick and tired of an endless cycle of conflict, dumping trillions of dollars into regime change and nation-building efforts in the Middle East, all of which have failed, he said. In private meetings, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the minority leader, has summarized the Democratic line of attack against Mr. Trump and his Republicans allies as the 3 C's: chaos, costs, and corruption, saying the war touches on all 3. Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the House Minority Leader, has encouraged his members to prosecute the case against Republicans and the war with his own alliterative slogan, accountability and affordability. The party's congressional committees and affiliated super PACs have attacked Republicans in battleground districts over high gas prices, tying the increased costs to their support of Mr. Trump and the war. House Democratic leaders have encouraged lawmakers to hold events in their districts on the theme of health care, not warfare, on Monday, which is the 16th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act becoming law. As Democrats press those attacks in television ads and online messaging, Republicans are supporting the war as necessary for national security, but many are largely trying to avoid discussion of higher costs at home. The GOP's two major campaign committees have ceded messaging about the war to the White House, instead focusing on hitting Democrats on issues like border security and funding the government. In Congress, Senate Republicans spent much of this past week pushing a strict voter identification bill demanded by President Trump that is unlikely to pass. House Republicans passed legislation to deport non-citizens who assault federal law enforcement dogs and immediately attack Democrats who voted against it. In recent days, the White House has floated a slew of policies aimed at bringing down gas prices, including reversing years of sanctions on Iran for oil that was already being shipped. It also relaxed a maritime law that restricts the way oil is transported. But experts doubt those efforts will have a meaningful impact on prices consumers see at the pump, which are now inching towards $4 per gallon across the country. Representative Zach Nunn, a combat veteran who is running for re-election in a swing district near Des Moines, Iowa, acknowledged the high price of gas, but said voters in his district support the administration's national security goals. The folks I hear from aren't asking us to look the other way on a regime that's been killing Americans and threatening the world with a nuclear weapon, he said. They want this mission done right, done fast, and they want their costs to come down. Still, while the U.S. economy remains resilient, many families are struggling with mounting debt, dwindling savings, and a weakened labor market. And rising fuel prices also drive up the costs of everyday goods. A price spike in gas highlights the real reason I think the Republicans are in trouble for the midterms, which is Trump and one job, Trump had one job, and that was cost of living, said Rob Stutzman, a Republican operative based in California, where high gas prices are a perennial electoral issue. He and Republicans have not been able to deliver on that. Already there are signs that the war is costing Mr. Trump support among the independent, Latino, and working class voters who boosted him to victory in 2024. While surveys show that he still has the staunch support of Republicans, particularly those who identify as part of his MAGA movement, a majority of Democrats and independents oppose U.S. military action in Iran. A handful of right-wing Republicans, including well-known MAGA influences and politicians, have raised concerns that Mr. Trump will alienate his supporters and cause a disastrous election for Republicans in the midterms. I am tired of the industrial war complex getting all of our hard-earned tax dollars, Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado told CNN on Thursday. I have folks in Colorado who can't afford to live. We need America First policies right now. Throughout his second term, Mr. Trump has repeatedly attempted to sell unpopular policies by asking Americans to bear personal economic pain for what he believes will help the country. When he imposed sweeping tariffs, he promised that the higher cost for goods and groceries would be worth the price of rebalancing global trade. And after Republicans passed Mr. Trump's sprawling domestic policy bill in July, they pushed back on concerns that the law helped the wealthy while raising health care costs for working class people by telling voters that the policies would result in expansive economic growth for the country. On Tuesday, Vice President J.D. Vance told supporters gathered at a manufacturing plant in Auburn Hills, Michigan, that higher gas prices would not last forever, and neither would the war. We promise that when this conflict draws to a close, when this operation draws to a close, we're going to see those energy prices come back down to reality, he said. Other Republicans have used language that Democrats believe will allow them to cast their opponents as unconcerned with costs, even if the war does end in the coming weeks. Maybe you take one less trip to Starbucks so that gas goes a little further, Michelle Tafoya, a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in Minnesota, said in a radio interview last week. Let's just try to be patriots about this. Presidents of both parties have looked to gas prices as a rough measure of national economic sentiment. Ron Klain, who served as chief of staff for President Joseph R. Biden Jr., was so concerned that he checked gas prices every day, pointing out in social media posts when they dipped. But the war has added an even more unpredictable element. As Mr. Crow put it, citing an old military maxim, the enemy always has a vote. A private document from Navigator Research, a liberal polling firm that has been circulating among House Democrats, encouraged them to focus less on criticizing Mr. Trump's wartime partnership with Israel and his failure to get congressional approval for the assault on Iran, and more on economic issues. The top testing messages were arguments that Mr. Trump was raising gas prices and spending billions while ignoring cost of living concerns, increasing the price of health care, and cutting food assistance programs. Josh Turek, a Democratic legislator running for Senate in Iowa, says the issue is resonating in his state. 3 soldiers from Iowa have been killed in the conflict, and shipping disruptions are driving fertilizer prices to near record highs right before the spring planting season. All the doors that I've knocked, all the places that I've gone, I've never heard a single Iowan tell me that they want another forever war, Mr. Turek said. What they're concerned about is just its affordability. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, our next article is titled Pregnant and Seeking Care in ICE Lockup. I was scared. One second here. Okay, now I'm ready. An ICE lockup and pregnant. I was scared. Candy Castillo-Calantes was 6 months pregnant when she stepped inside the giant tent where she would live for the next 47 days. Her enclosure at the South Texas Detention Center held dozens of bunk beds, she said, with one tiny slit for a window. Women wailed late into the night for their husbands and children. When Miss Castillo-Calantes experienced vaginal bleeding and asked for medical care at the facility, she and her lawyer said she was offered only water, prenatal vitamins, and a temperature check. It's not a center that we know has a doctor, Ms. Castillo-Calantes, a 38-year-old Venezuelan who obtained temporary legal status under the Biden administration, said in an interview from the facility in late February. The people here can't tell you everything is fine. Ms. Castillas Calantes said she had heard from other detainees about a woman who had gone into labor at their detention center months earlier. She was terrified that she could be next. Pregnant women who have been swept up in the President Trump's immigration crackdown have been held in detention centers as late as 8 months into their pregnancies without adequate food or medical care, according to a New York Times examination of 10 cases. The Times Review found that in those cases, the Department of Homeland Security violated long-standing agency guidelines for how to treat pregnant women in detention, subjecting them to conditions that medical experts say you can jeopardize the health of mothers and their babies. Pregnant women said they were served food covered in cockroaches and water that tasted like bleach. They described how immigration and customs enforcement agents shackled their hands and feet, refusing to believe that they were pregnant until a bump appeared. One woman said ICE agents ignored her as she lay on the floor screaming in pain and took her to the emergency room only after her fellow inmates began banging on the door for help. This account is based on interviews with pregnant women either currently detained or recently released, as well as analysis of court filings, government documents, and medical records. The Biden administration instituted a policy under which pregnant women could only be detained in exceptional circumstances, such as when a person poses a national security threat or an imminent risk of death, violence, or physical harm to someone. While Trump administration officials have offered conflicting opinions in court on whether that policy remains in effect, Lauren Biss, a Department of Homeland Security spokeswoman, said in a statement to the Times that it still stands. Ms. Biss also said that pregnancy in ICE detention is exceedingly rare, involving 0.18% of all undocumented immigrants in custody. That comes out to be 126 women, according to recent estimates of the number of people in detention. Ms. Biss added that no women had given birth in ICE custody under the Trump administration, and that the medical care provided to women in detention was the best health care many of these individuals have received in their entire lives. She said that clean and bottled water was provided for detainees. Pregnant women will receive regular prenatal visits, mental health services, nutritional support, and accommodations aligned with community standards of care, Ms. Biss said in a statement. Abigail Jackson, a White House spokeswoman, said that ICE detention facilities were safe and clean and had the highest standards. The issue of pregnant women in detention has galvanized an unlikely coalition of advocates, including anti-abortion leaders eager to protect undocumented pregnant women and their babies. I don't think we should have detaining of pregnant women, period, said Lila Rose, the founder and president of the national anti-abortion group Live Action. Ms. Rose recently signed an open letter to Mr. Trump urging the administration to enforce the Biden-era guidance. It's only putting lives that are already vulnerable in a more vulnerable position, she added. Of the cases examined by the Times, some pregnant women were deported while others were temporarily released in the United States before they delivered their babies. Some remain in detention. It's alarming to hear how these women are being treated, said Eunice Cho, a former senior counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, who co-authored a report last October that documented over a dozen cases of pregnant women in detention, none of which overlapped with the cases examined by the Times. When people inform agents that they are pregnant, it is not really being taken into consideration. In Texas, Miss Castillo Calantes was detained at Camp East Montana, a 5,000-bed tent facility opened over summer to accommodate the surge of immigrants under arrest. A group of congressional Democrats last month called for the site's permanent closure, citing inadequate medical care amid an outbreak of measles there. Ms. Biz, the Department of Homeland Security spokeswoman, said that Ms. Castillo Calantes underwent a medical evaluation immediately upon arriving at the detention center and that she never reported any bleeding to medical staff members. Ms. Castillo Calantes said she felt isolated and terrified, unable to access the care she felt she needed. When you feel unwell, they say, well, it's normal because you're pregnant, Ms. Castillo Calantes said in late February, fearful that she might go into early labor while living in a tent. If you feel unwell, drink water. 4 days later, Ms. Castillo Calantes was rushed to the hospital. Months of waiting for care. From the moment they were arrested, women interviewed by the Times said ICE agents appeared unconcerned by the fact they were pregnant. In 5 cases identified by the Times, ICE agents cuffed a pregnant woman's hands and ankles, even after learning about their pregnancies, according to the women, their lawyers, their family members, and legal briefs. 2 said the agents wrapped chains around their bellies, refusing to remove them even after one woman began bleeding on the airplane bound for a detention center. When ICE agents arrested Jennifer Benavida Semendo, 22, in the Boston area last month, she said they put her in handcuffs and chains and pushed her into a van without providing a warrant or telling her where she was going. I told them, you don't have to do this. I'm pregnant and it hurts. My belly is big, said Miss Semito, who was between 5 and 6 months pregnant at the time. They just said, we have to do this. Pregnant women are supposed to receive special care in ICE detention, according to national detention standards published by the Department of Homeland Security, robust guidance that dates back to early 2000s. The standards prohibit the use of handcuffs or other restraints on pregnant women absent truly extraordinary circumstances that render restraints absolutely necessary. In its written statement, the departments maintained that ICE complied with these standards, saying that a pregnant detainee would be restrained only in the exceedingly rare situation where doing so would protect the life and safety of the detainee. The standards also require pregnant women to receive close medical supervision and access to prenatal and specialized care. Most women interviewed for this article said that while in ICE detention, they receive little or no prenatal care, a regimen to facilitate a healthy pregnancy that is supposed to include regular medical checkups, tests, and ultrasounds. While ICE is responsible for overseeing the medical care provided at all of its detention centers, many are operated by private contractors, which sometimes hire other companies to handle medical services. Acquisition Logistics, a small Virginia-based company, received roughly $1.2 million from the federal government last year to operate Camp East Montana, where Ms. Castillo Calantes was detained. Acquisition Logistics did not respond to a request for comment. Women interviewed for this article who did see a doctor while in detention either received that care at a hospital during a medical emergency or reported waiting months in detention for detention personnel to arrange an appointment. Amanda Fenego Cardoso, 22, was several months pregnant when she was detained by ICE in Florida last fall after a shoplifting arrest. While Ms. Fenego Cardoso asked to see a doctor immediately upon arriving at the Otero County Processing Center in New Mexico, she said. Detention center staff members promised that they would soon make her an appointment. But then another month passed, and another. When she finally saw a doctor in December, almost 6 months pregnant, she said she learned that she had gestational diabetes and preeclampsia, both serious health conditions that classify a pregnancy at high risk. After that initial visit, Ms. Finango Cardosa said she was taken to a medical facility for a checkup every 2 weeks. I was scared, said Ms. Finango Cardosa, who was granted temporary parole after coming into the United States from Cuba in 2023. I thought I was going to have some kind of problem because of so many months without attention. You just don't know what's going on. Ms. Finango Cardosa was released in February at 33 weeks pregnant. Her lawyer, Sam Badawi, had by that point filed several emergency motions citing the grave physical and emotional harm that would result from continued detention in the final stages of her pregnancy. Ms. Biz at the Department of Homeland Security said Ms. Finango Cardosa was prescribed a daily prenatal vitamin and referred to an off-site OBGYN who saw and treated her regularly until she was released. Some women said they struggled to get the attention of ICE agents even in acute medical emergencies. Last spring, Iris Diana Monteroso Lemus had a miscarriage almost 6 months into her pregnancy while detained at the Richwood Correctional Center in Monroe, Louisiana, records show. Ms. Monteroso Lemus, whose miscarriage received widespread media attention at the time, came into the United States illegally from Guatemala in 2018 and had been arrested on charges of child abuse, neglect, or endangerment in Tennessee. She also had a warrant for homicide in Guatemala, which, according to a document surfaced by the Daily Beast, was dismissed last May. Government documents reviewed by the Times show that Monteroso Lemus raised alarms about her health almost 1 month before her miscarriage. She reported what she felt like contractions, stomach pain, and 21 pounds of weight loss, and she asked for an ultrasound to check on her baby, according to the documents. There was no indication in the records reviewed by the Times that Ms. Monteroso Lemus received medical services between the time she made that report and when she was taken to a nearby hospital to receive treatment for the miscarriage. In the records from the hospital, a doctor noted that Ms. Monteroso Lemus told the detention center staff members that her pregnancy didn't feel right for a few days before she arrived at the hospital, but that nothing was done. Around 6 months pregnant, Miss Semito spent 3 days last month in a holding cell with no beds at an ICE office in Burlington, Mass. At 2 a.m. on her third night in the facility, Miss Semito said she felt abdominal pain so intense that she started screaming and carrying on the holding room door. The ICE agents, she said, were sitting right there watching TV for about 10 minutes before they came to check on her. When the officer eventually appeared, she said he surveyed the room and said, "Which one of you needs help?" He could see me, Miss Semito said. I was literally laying down on the floor in front of them. It was just terrifying. Ms. Biz at the Department of Homeland Security said that ICE officers took Semito to the hospital immediately after she complained of upper abdominal pain. Ms. Semito came into the country at age 13 from Cape Verde with her mother as a conditional permanent resident, according to her lawyer. By the time Ms. Semito was arrested for not appearing in court for a domestic violence charge, her status as a permanent resident had been terminated without her knowledge, Ms. Semito said. While still in detention, Ms. Semito was hospitalized for 7 days with gallstones and a possible obstruction in her bile duct that could have increased her risk of infection, according to a legal brief prepared by Blair Johnson Wiley, the chair of the obstetrics and gynecology department at the hospital where Miss Semito was treated. She also had electrolyte deficiencies, Dr. Wiley said, which could have been caused by her diet in detention, where Miss Semito said she was offered only microwavable macaroni and cheese for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Miss Semito's detention at an ICE facility put her at higher risk of preterm labor, Dr. Wiley wrote. Prenatal care is critical throughout pregnancy, the doctor added, and specifically when a patient experiences complications. What will become of me? Several months after she arrived at South Louisiana ICE Processing Center in December, 29-year-old Ellie Johanna Lopera learned that she could be deported to Ecuador, a country she had never been to, months before she was due to give birth. We don't know Ecuador, nor do we know anyone in Ecuador, said Miss Lopera's husband, Robinson Carvajal. His wife had sought asylum 4 years ago when she came to the United States from Colombia. She has no idea what would happen to there, with the baby or with her, he said. Ms. Biz at the Department of Homeland Security said that Ms. Lopera had received regular medical checkups and that she has not made any complaints or concerns regarding the pregnancy. Ms. Fenego Cardosa also was informed while in detention in New Mexico that she would be deported to Ecuador. I thought, I have no one there. I have nothing, said Ms. Fenego Cardosa, who has been temporarily released from detention but could still be deported. If I have my baby in Ecuador, what will become of me? Where am I going to live? Where are they going to leave me? What am I going to do? How am I going to get medical care? In a statement, the Department of Homeland Security said that no pregnant women have been threatened with removal to a third country, she said, and that any illegal alien is subject to a third country removal if they cannot be removed to their home country. Women in ICE detention have been deported well into their third trimesters. In one case last spring, ICE agents tried to deport a Mexican woman with a high-risk pregnancy on an ICE plane when she was about 8 months pregnant, according to the woman who spoke on the condition of anonymity because of fear of retribution from the U.S. government. When officials on that flight turned her away, saying she was too far into her pregnancy to fly, ICE agents returned her to the detention facility. She and her lawyer, Helen Vargas Crebas, said. The woman was in the final stages of a high-risk pregnancy, Ms. Vargas Crebas wrote in an email to several ICE officials on May 19, 2025, asking for her client to be released from ICE custody. We are gravely concerned that she may give birth while in detention, which poses significant risks to both her health and that of her unborn child. The woman who Ms. Vargas Crebas has said had an order of removal at the time, said ICE agents pressured her to sign a release that would have allowed her to board a commercial flight at such a late stage in her present pregnancy. Terrified, she said, she decided to sign the release and board the plane, arriving in Mexico before she gave birth. In South Texas, Ms. Castilla Calantes, the woman who feared giving birth in detention, left Camp East Montana on February 25th, bound for a nearby hospital. Officials at the detention center had agreed to take her in, she said, after she spent the day vomiting with a high fever. By the time she got to the hospital, she said she was 1 centimeter dilated, a possible sign that she could be starting toward preterm labor. Ms. Castillo-Calantes did not have her baby that day, and her pregnancy complications, amid her pregnancy complications. Immigration agents agreed to release her, said one of her lawyers, Iris Ramos. Around the time she is due to give birth, Ms. Castillo Calantes is scheduled to return to court for a hearing on her immigration status. The judge could grant her application for asylum, Ms. Ramos said, or her order to be deported. She is still in removable proceedings, Ms. Ramos said. Being released doesn't mean she is out of the woods. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, our next article is Feeling Overshadowed, Zelensky Hopes to Revive Peace Talks. Very bad feeling about Mideast war. 3 weeks after the outbreak of war in the Middle East froze U.S.-led negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, President Vladimir Zelensky is pushing to get them back on track. In recent days, Mr. Zelensky has lamented that the talks have been constantly postponed and argued that they should resume even as the United States is preoccupied with the war in Iran. While few in Ukraine believed that the peace process had brought the war with Russia much closer to an end, the two sides were talking face to face and had narrowed some gaps. On Thursday, the Kremlin said there was a situational pause in the negotiations, more evidence that whatever momentum had been building risked evaporating. But only hours later, Mr. Zelensky dropped a surprise announcement. Ukrainian officials were en route to the United States for weekend talks, he said. It is time to resume them, Mr. Zelensky said in his evening address on Thursday. The Ukrainian leader told reporters on Friday that Russian officials would not attend the negotiations, but he said it was important to hold the dialogue with the United States after suspended sanctions on Russia oil a couple weeks ago, a move that Mr. Zelensky called dangerous for Ukraine. The suspension is intended to help bring down the energy prices that have soared because of the Iran war. Mr. Zelensky also said the U.S. meeting offered a chance to continue talks on guarantees for Ukraine's post-war security. There was no immediate comment from the White House or the Kremlin. A meeting on American soil would represent something of a victory for Mr. Zelensky. Days ago, he told the BBC he had a very bad feeling about the effects of the Iran conflict on the war in his own country, as Russia benefits from higher oil prices and Gulf nations deplete global stocks of Patriot air defense missiles. Mr. Zelensky has fought to keep the world's focus on Ukraine, giving interviews and touring Europe. Now is a moment we have several threats at once, said Viktor Schlinglak, the head of the Institute of World Policy, our Ukrainian research group, adding that the threats were pushing Mr. Zelensky to become more active. Ukrainian and Russian negotiators last met on February 26 in Geneva, along with their American counterparts. The two warring sides had said that the next round of talks would be held in the United Arab Emirates. But on February 28th, the United States and Israel started attacking Iran, and the fighting soon spread through the Middle East. Mr. Zelensky initially suggested simply moving the talks to another location, though he later acknowledged that the United States would be unable to participate. He told the New York Times that U.S. officials had suggested that Ukraine hold bilateral talks with Russia, but that he had rejected the idea because he wanted to stick to a trilateral format. The Ukrainian leader has tried to find opportunities in what is otherwise a perilous moment for his country. He sent Ukrainian military experts to help the United States and his its Persian Gulf allies combat Iranian drones. As he drummed up support in European capitals and gave numerous interviews, he hammered home how the Middle East war intersected with Ukraine's. Mr. Zelensky has cast Ukraine's defense expertise as a useful commodity in hopes of leveraging it into security partnerships that could yield vast profits for the country's arms industry. His outreach is also an attempt to counter criticism from Washington that Ukraine only takes. I would like the U.S. not to perceive Ukraine as a country that merely asks for help, Mr. Zelensky said Tuesday. That is not the case. It remains to be seen whether the message will resonate in the White House. President Trump, who said last year that Mr. Zelensky had no cards in negotiation, told Politico this month that the Ukrainian leader had even less cards. Those remarks did not go over well in Ukraine, not least because Kiev's forces have made modest gains in the battlefield in recent weeks. Mr. Trump has repeatedly cast Mr. Zelensky, not President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia, as impeding peace, and the U.S. president had scoffed at Ukraine's offer to help combat Iranian drones, saying that the last person we need help is from Zelensky. Mr. Zelensky has brushed off Mr. Trump's remarks as rhetoric and expressed gratitude for being allowed to purchase U.S. weapons while suggesting a meeting with the American president. The Ukrainian leader does not want to completely lose Mr. Trump's support or make an enemy of him, but also probably recognizes he is not a friend of Ukraine, said Maria Zolkina, head of regional security and conflict studies at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, a Ukrainian think tank. She said having Mr. Trump distracted by the Iran war was not necessarily bad for Ukraine, which the United States has pressed to make difficult territorial concessions to Moscow. Every time he focused on Ukraine totally, she said, it was like when he tried to push Ukraine for asymmetric compromise that would benefit Russia more. Okay, and here's a few little facts of interest for you. Only 1.4% of New York City apartments are now available for rent, and a mere 0.4% of those apartments cost less than $1,100 a month. In Raphael's painting known as the Alba Madonna from around 1510, the Virgin Mary is not the idealized blonde of earlier Renaissance culture, but a brunette, most likely modeled on Margherita Lutti, the artist's Roman girlfriend. Recent surveys of Americans' seasonal preferences place spring a distant second or even third to autumn, the runaway winner. It took 34 years to litigate the 40 wills lobbed at the court after the 1976 death of Howard Hughes, the Las Vegas-based mogul and eccentric who died intestate without a spouse or children. The theory of panpsychism proposes that everything in existence, even a grain of sand, possesses a tiny spark of proto-consciousness, and that these minute elements of awareness combine to form our rich mental experience. AI-generated artists are amassing millions of monthly listeners on Spotify, and users of AI composition tool Suno reportedly crank out 7 million songs per day. And that's it for today. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 22nd, 2026 issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1. And your reader has been Karen. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you have a good day and take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.